Vladimir Putin took the oath of office today and was sworn in as Russia's president for another 6-year term. This will be Putin's 5th term in office. Most EU nations, along with the United States, Britain, and Canada, boycotted the swearing-in. However, France said it would send its ambassador. Putin's inauguration comes one day after Russia announced that it was planning a drill to test its tactical nuclear weapons. Putin has already served nearly a quarter of a century, and he is the longest-serving Kremlin leader since Josef Stalin. Putin's time in office and the evolution of his regime is the subject of an article published in The Atlantic this week. It's titled "The New Propaganda War." It dives into efforts to destabilize democratic values from inside Russia and China, and tonight it's the subject of our spotlight. Anne Applebaum joins me now. Anne, great to speak with you.
Great to speak with you, too.
Talk to me about the sense you have of how the Russian public at large really feels about Putin as he's now entering his 5th term as president.
You know, it's very hard to talk about Russian public opinion because right now there is no such thing as public opinion in Russia. People are not able to say freely what they think. There's no such thing as an open conversation. Even private conversations are probably constrained. I just today was reading a statistic. During Putin's last term as president, 116,000 people were put on trial and punished or imprisoned for repressive and political crimes. That's a lot of people, and of course everybody is aware that this is happening and would know it. It's a country that has closed itself off from the outside world. That has, seeking to create a kind of new ideology of constant war, total war, all the time with the United States, and so there's no, and I should say with the broader Western world, and so there is really no, there's nothing like an open conversation. So it's very hard to say what people really think or what they really feel.
Well, then, what do you think Vladimir Putin is thinking about the fact that certain countries, Canada being one of them, have decided not to send a representative to the inauguration, despite the fact that they were invited?
I know there was, unfortunately, I think 1 or 2 Western countries are sending ambassadors. I think that's a great mistake. Remembering in particular that this inauguration wasn't real. I mean, it wasn't a real election. He wasn't, there was no competition. There was anything like what we would call a normal public conversation around the election. So calling it inauguration is equally farcical.
You wrote a piece for The Atlantic. It's called "The New Propaganda War." A lot of detail in there. And you talk about the attack on democratic values from inside autocratic governments. Specifically, can we talk about Russia here and how it is you think democracy has been poisoned in Russia?
So autocratic propaganda, not just in Russia, but in China and elsewhere nowadays, is not really what it used to be. It used to be, we brag about the greatness of the state and how many tractors we produce every year. It's really now much more focused on outside enemies and, of course, internal enemies. And both Putin, like Xi, and other autocratic leaders have identified the language of democracy as one of their greatest challenges, their greatest enemies. And so they seek to undermine their own democratic oppositions at home, and they seek to undermine democracies abroad and around the world. And towards that end, they speak about degeneracy and decline and chaos. They seek to poison the idea of democracy and the idea of free speech for their own people, because they don't want people to aspire to that or to want it. This has been one of, it's been a clear part of Russian ideology for the last decade. I think it probably peaked in a way, or the emergency that Putin felt began with the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014, when young Ukrainians waved flags, called for democracy, called for transparency, called for an end to corruption. And I think Putin saw in that potential for the same kind of rebellion in Russia. And so his goal for the last decade has been to undermine those ideas, the people who have them, and the people who speak about them.
And that's just the last decade. I mean, he's been at this for a long time. Do you think that Vladimir Putin believes his own propaganda?
I It's very hard to know whether people believe their own propaganda. I think probably at this stage he does. He certainly thinks of himself as a kind of world historical figure. He has compared himself in conversations, to Catherine the Great or Peter the Great or even to Stalin, and he sees those kinds of people as his ideal. He would like to have that kind of historical role, and so in the need to build his ideas up and to build himself up, I think he probably does believe all that. I think he probably has convinced himself that America and Canada and the Western world are evil and trying to undermine him. There was a particular change. I mean, you're certainly right that he's been heading in this direction for 2 decades, not just one. There was a particular change that happened during COVID. He was by himself for a long time. He spent a lot of time reading history. I'm not quite sure what history he was reading, but he emerged with a very clear idea of himself as a historical leader. And I think that's how he's presenting himself to Russians today.
In terms of the war with Ukraine, what kind of support do you think that he actually has for this within the country?
It's not like people have a choice to support it or not to support it. This is all there is. There's no way to voice your dislike of it. I mean, some people have done it and paid a high price for it. Occasionally people are arrested even for saying in a restaurant, in private, and having been overheard, people are arrested for criticizing the war in Ukraine. So it's actually illegal to criticize the war. So it's therefore impossible to know. It's true that there's no mass enthusiasm for the war. We don't see millions of people enthusiastically signing up, and people do sign up to fight if they're paid enough, if they come from very poor parts of the country. But there's not a movement in favor of it. So I think it's just a part of life that people have come to accept.
I want to ask you about Alexei Navalny and the fact that his wife Yulia has pledged to continue his fight against Putin's regime. Of course, he has died just prior to this recent election in March in Russia. Do you have a sense as to whether or not that campaign that she may take on actually has any threat to Vladimir Putin?
Anybody who is able to mobilize emotion, or anybody who's able to create a sense of an alternative in Russia, will be seen as a threat to Putin. I think she is somebody who enjoyed really wide respect in Russia, partly because she always stayed out of politics in the past, and it's clear she's only decided to play a political role following the death of her husband. And so she enjoys enormous respect and trust. The question is, will what she says reach people, and will they be able to hear it? And that's obviously much more difficult now. There are a number of Russian exile groups who do YouTube programs, and they seek other ways of communicating with and talking to Russians, including people who are associated with Navalny and his movement. But it's still a minority. So one doesn't want to underrate her chances, and she's a person who, as I said, is perceived as powerful and honest, and working for the good of Russia. On the other hand, how many people will hear her is hard to say.
And to your point about it being difficult to gauge opinion within Russia and difficult to know what is on the mind of Vladimir Putin, I want to know what you made of former Fox News host Tucker Carlson recently going to Russia, interviewing Vladimir Putin. That was an interview. It got a lot of reaction, not all of it positive, some of it very much negative for the fact that he would perhaps fall victim to Russian propaganda. But what do you think about the fact that he did it, and was there something to be gleaned from it?
So there's nothing wrong with interviewing Putin. There was a big Washington Post story about Russia that came out in the last couple of days and they said at the beginning, we asked to interview Putin. The BBC has periodically asked to interview Putin. There's nothing wrong with doing it. I mean, what's notable is that Putin has turned down all these interviews in recent years, and the only person he chose was Tucker Carlson, and he used the Tucker Carlson interview to lecture the world about his views, his strange and very skewed views of history. And Carlson was really unable to make the interview be about anything else except Putin as propaganda. I mean, the oddity about Carlson is that he's playing such a familiar role, something that we know from the 1930s when, gullible communists used to go to Moscow and repeat, propaganda and talk about how marvelous things were in Russia. And Carlson did that as well. He talked about Russian supermarkets and Russian subways, almost as if he'd never been to an American supermarket or seen an American subway or a European one. And so he's somehow decided to play that role, to play the role of the Western propagandist advertising what's good about Russia. And it's very hard for me to read his mind or to understand why he's doing it. But it was a very, very strange public event.
Let me finally ask here, as we watch this inauguration, play out here, and Vladimir Putin becomes potentially a very historical figure within Russia, the longest-serving leader, I think, in the last 200 years in that country, as he enters his fifth term. What do you think that the West gets wrong about Putin and his support?
I think the West for a long time underestimated Putin, and they underestimated the damage that Russia can do. Russia was seen for a long time as a kind of, I think President Obama spoke about it as Russia as a kind of regional power, not one with global ambitions, not something we have to worry about. Our real, economic challenges coming from China. I think that was a mistake. As the article I wrote that was published this week describes, the Russians have a very global view. They have a very clear view about the need to undermine democracy. They do it in Europe, in North America, in Africa. They support dictatorships in different forms in different places. They have new alliances with Iran, with North Korea, with Venezuela, with China. They see themselves very much part of an autocratic network. And I think we've underestimated the power of that network and the threat that it poses to us in all kinds of ways, politically, economically, culturally, in many other ways.
And Applebaum, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you.